The banging on the door came before sunrise, hard enough to shake the old wooden frame. Alara Winters sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened to her father's voice rise in panic downstairs. She had heard that tone before, but never this early and never this loud. She pulled a shawl over her shoulders and crept to the top of the stairs. Below, 3 men stood in the hallway, their coats dusted with morning frost. One of them held a folded paper and read from it in a flat, cold voice. Her father, Edmund Winters, stood with his back against the wall, his face pale as chalk. "You have 7 days," the man said. "Pay what you owe or the house is no longer yours." The door slammed shut behind them, and silence filled the hallway like water filling a cracked bowl. Alara came down the stairs slowly, her bare feet cold against the wood. Her father did not look up at her. He simply sat down on the bottom step and put his head in his hands. "Father," she said quietly, "what is happening?" He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if he had swallowed gravel. "I have made mistakes, Alara, mistakes that cannot be undone with kind words or quiet prayers." She sat beside him, careful not to touch him, because she knew he did not like to be comforted when he felt weak. "Tell me, whatever it is, we will find a way through it." He laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "There is no way through it, unless—" He stopped himself, shaking his head as though the thought frightened even him. "Unless what?" Edmund stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray fields beyond their home. The Winters family had once owned land that stretched for miles, but year by year, piece by piece, it had been sold, mortgaged, and lost. Alara had grown up hearing stories of grand parties and full stables, stories that felt more like fairy tales than memories of her own family. "There is a man," her father said slowly, "a duke who lives far from here in a house called Blackmore Hall. He is wealthy beyond anything we have ever known, and he is looking for a wife." Alara felt a strange coldness settle into her chest. "A wife," she repeated. "Yes." Her father turned to face her now, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before, shame mixed with desperation. "He has agreed to pay off everything, every debt, every creditor, in exchange for a bride." "And you have chosen me," Alara said. It was not a question. Her father did not answer, but his silence was answer enough. Alara stood very still, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though nothing in the room had actually moved. She was 19 years old. She had imagined marriage before, the way any young woman does, quiet daydreams of a kind face, a gentle voice, perhaps a small cottage with flowers by the door. She had never imagined being handed over like a payment on a debt. "Does he have a name?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Ashford Vane," her father said. "Duke of Blackmore." The name meant nothing to her, and yet something about the way her father said it made her uneasy, as though he were speaking of a stranger he feared more than he understood. She waited for him to say more, but he turned back to the window instead, and she realized the conversation, at least for him, was already over. Alara walked out to the small garden behind the house, needing air, needing space away from the 4 walls that suddenly felt like they were closing in around her. The garden had once been her mother's pride, rows of lavender and roses tended with careful hands, but years of neglect had let weeds creep in among the flowers, and only a few stubborn blooms remained. She sat on the old stone bench where she used to read as a child, and let herself cry, quietly, so no one inside the house would hear. She thought of the girls in the village who teased her sometimes for her family's fading fortune, who whispered behind their hands about the Winters' name losing its shine. She had always told herself their words did not matter, that pride was not something measured in land or gold. Now she wondered if she had only been telling herself a comforting lie, the same kind of lie her father seemed to tell himself every time another creditor came knocking. When she finally returned inside, the house was quiet again, her father having retreated to his room, and Alara made her way to the kitchen, where a single candle still burned low on the table. She found herself thinking of practical matters now, the kind of thoughts that helped keep the fear at bay. What would she need to pack? What clothes were fit for a duke's house, if any of hers were fit at all? whether she would be permitted to write letters home, and whether anyone would answer them if she did. That night, Alara lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling above her bed. She thought of all the whispered stories she had heard from traveling merchants and servants over the years, stories about noble families with strange secrets, about grand houses hiding grander sorrows. She had always believed such stories were exaggerated, told to entertain rather than to inform. Now she wondered if perhaps there was truth buried inside them. The next morning her father called her into his study, a small room lined with empty shelves where books had once stood before they, too, had been sold. A woman named Beatrice, who had served the Winters family since Alara was a child, stood near the door, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. Beatrice was the closest thing to a mother Alara had, since her own mother had passed away when Alara was only 7. "You should know what you are agreeing to," Edmund said, gesturing for Alara to sit. "The Duke's man came to see me 2 days ago. His name is Colton, and he serves as steward of Blackmore Hall. He explained the terms plainly, and I saw no reason to refuse them." 2 days ago, Alara said slowly. "You decided this 2 days ago, and you are only telling me now." Her father's jaw tightened. "I was hoping there might be another way. There is not." Beatrice stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Alara, dear, listen to what your father has to say. There is more you should know." Edmund cleared his throat. "The Duke, Ashford Vane, has not been seen outside his estate in many years. It is said that he lost his sight as a young man in an accident that no one speaks of clearly. Some say a fire, others say a fall. The details change depending on who tells the story." Alara's stomach turned. "You are marrying me to a blind man I have never met, in a house I have never seen, because of debts I did not create." "I am sorry," her father said, and for the first time his voice cracked. "I am truly sorry, but if you do not agree, we will lose everything. This house, the land that remains, even the roof over Beatrice's head. I have failed you already in so many ways. Do not let my failure be the reason you starve in the streets." Alara looked at Beatrice, searching for some sign of hope, some suggestion that this could be avoided. But Beatrice only lowered her eyes, and in that small gesture, Alara understood there was truly no other choice. "When must I leave?" she asked. 5 days, her father said. "The carriage will come to take you to Blackmore Hall. The wedding will happen there, quietly, within the week after your arrival." 5 days. Alara felt the number settle over her like a heavy blanket, smothering the last of her small hopes for a different kind of life. She thought of the girls she had grown up with in the village, girls who would marry local farmers or merchants, girls who would know their husbands for months or years before standing beside them at an altar. She would know nothing. She would arrive as a stranger and leave as a wife. That evening, Beatrice came to her room carrying a small wooden box. Inside were a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to Alara's mother, saved through all the years of hardship, hidden from the creditors who had taken nearly everything else. "Your mother would have wanted you to have these," Beatrice said, placing the box gently into Alara's hands. "Wear them on your wedding day. Let her be with you even from far away." Alara opened the box and looked at the delicate silver necklace inside, its small pendant shaped like a leaf. She remembered, faintly, her mother wearing it when she was very small, humming softly as she worked in the garden. The memory brought tears to her eyes, though she was not sure if she cried for her mother, for herself, or for the uncertain future waiting at the end of a long road she had not chosen to walk. "Beatrice," she said quietly, "do you believe the stories about the Duke, about him being cruel or cursed?" Beatrice sat down beside her, taking her hand. "I believe that stories grow larger the further they travel from the truth. A man who hides himself away will always be spoken of in whispers, because people fear what they do not understand. But I cannot tell you what kind of man he truly is. No one in this village has seen him with their own eyes in many years." "That is not very comforting," Alara said, managing a small, tired smile. "No," Beatrice agreed, "but I can tell you this. You are stronger than you know, Alara Winters. Whatever waits for you at Blackmore Hall, you will not face it as a frightened child. You will face it as your mother's daughter, and she was the bravest woman I ever knew." Alara held onto those words over the following days, repeating them to herself each time fear crept into her thoughts. She packed the few belongings she owned into a single trunk, some clothes, a handful of books she had managed to keep, and the small wooden box holding her mother's jewelry. She said goodbye to the fields she had run through as a child, to the small stream behind the house where she used to sit and think, to the life she had known, even in its poverty, because it had at least been familiar. On the morning she was to leave, her father stood by the carriage, unable to meet her eyes. "I know you may never forgive me for this," he said. Alara looked at him for a long moment. She thought of all the nights he had come home smelling of drink and regret, all the promises he had broken, all the small betrayals that had led them to this point. And yet she also saw a man who was breaking apart in front of her, a man who had made a desperate choice not out of cruelty, but out of fear and failure. "I do not know if I forgive you," she said honestly, "but I understand that you believed you had no other path. I hope, for both our sakes, that this Duke is not the monster the stories make him out to be." Her father nodded, unable to speak. Beatrice embraced her tightly, whispering a final blessing into her ear, and then it was time. Alara climbed into the carriage, and as the wheels began to turn, she looked back one last time at the only home she had ever known, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the hills. Ahead of her lay a road she knew nothing about, leading to a house she had never seen, and a husband whose face she could not picture. She pressed her hand against the small wooden box in her lap, feeling the shape of her mother's necklace through the wood, and tried to steady the trembling in her chest. Whatever waited for her at Blackmore Hall, there was no turning back now. She thought, as the carriage rolled steadily onward, of the many small futures she had once imagined for herself, all of them now folded away like a dress she would never wear again. There would be no quiet wedding among neighbors who had watched her grow up. No familiar face waiting at the altar, no mother to help her dress, no father walking her down an aisle with pride rather than shame written across his features. Instead, there would be a stranger's house, a stranger's name, and a stranger's face she could not yet picture no matter how many times she tried. The road stretched long and gray before them, winding away from everything she had ever known, and Alara pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the carriage window, watching her breath fog softly against it. Somewhere ahead, past hills she had never crossed and forests she had never seen, a man called the Blind Duke waited for a bride he had chosen sight unseen, in every sense of the word. She wondered if he felt any of the same uncertainty she carried now, or if wealth and title had long ago smoothed away such ordinary fears. For now, there was only the steady rhythm of hooves against the road, and the slow fading of daylight behind her, marking the last hours of the life she had always known. The carriage wheel struck a deep rut in the road, throwing Alara hard against the side panel, and the sudden jolt of pain in her shoulder pulled a sharp gasp from her lips. Outside, the coachman shouted something to the horses, and the carriage lurched forward again, faster than before, as if the man driving it wanted to reach their destination as quickly as possible and leave it just as fast. Alara rubbed her shoulder and looked out the small window. The countryside had changed since they left her village 3 days ago. The gentle green hills had given way to darker forests, thick with old trees whose branches twisted together overhead like grasping fingers. The sky itself seemed dimmer here, though it was still early afternoon, as if the sun did not shine as freely over this part of the land. She had shared the carriage for most of the journey with a quiet older woman named Margaret, who had been sent by Blackmore Hall to accompany her and see to her needs. Margaret was polite but careful with her words, answering questions with short, guarded sentences that told Alara little about what waited ahead. "How much longer until we arrive?" Alara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not long now, miss," Margaret said, glancing out the window herself. "We should reach the gates before evening." "You have worked at Blackmore Hall for some time." 10 years, Margaret answered, folding her hands in her lap. "Then you must know the Duke well." Margaret hesitated just long enough for Alara to notice. "I know him as well as anyone in the house does, miss, which is to say, not very well at all." Alara frowned. What do you mean by that? The Duke keeps to himself, Margaret said carefully. He has his reasons, I am sure. It is not my place to question them, and I would advise you not to question them either, at least not right away. She thought of asking Margaret directly about the scars people whispered of, about the fire or the fall that supposedly took the Duke's sight, but something in the older woman's posture told her the subject was closed for now. Instead, she turned her attention to smaller, safer questions, hoping to learn something useful from the answers even if the larger truths remained hidden. What is he like to work for? Alara asked, setting aside the rumors as a person day to day. Margaret considered this for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious care. He is fair, she said finally. He does not raise his voice, does not punish servants harshly for small mistakes. He pays wages on time, which is more than many households can say. If you are asking whether he is a cruel master, I would tell you no. In all my years serving him, I have never seen cruelty in him. But, Alara pressed, sensing there was more behind her words. But he is guarded, Margaret admitted. Careful with everyone, even those who have served him for a decade. It is as though he keeps a wall around himself that no one is permitted to cross, not fully. I used to think it was simply grief, from losing his father and his sight so close together. Now I am less certain what it is. The warning, though gently spoken, sent a small chill down Alara's spine. She wanted to ask more, but something in Margaret's expression told her the older woman had already said more than she intended. Alara turned back to the window instead, watching the trees blur past, and tried to calm the nervous fluttering in her stomach. As the carriage rolled deeper into the forest, they began to pass small clusters of cottages, their windows dark despite the fading daylight. Alara noticed that the few villagers she saw outside quickly stepped back from the road when the carriage approached, lowering their eyes as if avoiding the sight of it entirely. An old man standing near a well made a strange gesture with his hand as the carriage passed, one Alara did not recognize, but that made her skin prickle regardless. "Why do they look away?" she asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. "People in these parts have their own beliefs about Blackmore Hall," she finally said. "Old stories. Nothing more." "What kind of stories?" "The kind best left untold, miss, especially on the day you are meant to arrive there." Margaret's tone was final, and Alara understood she would get no further answers from her, at least not now. Forest thinned as the carriage climbed a long, winding hill, and when they crested the top, Alara caught her first glimpse of Blackmore Hall. She had imagined many things during the long journey, but nothing had prepared her for the sight before her. The house rose from the landscape like something carved from the mountain itself, its dark stone walls stretching upward into towers that seemed to scrape at the low clouds. Dozens of windows dotted its face, most of them dark, a few glowing faintly with candlelight. A high iron fence surrounded the property, its gate topped with sharp spikes shaped like thorns. "It is beautiful," Alara said softly, though beauty was not quite the right word. The house was striking, undeniably impressive, but there was something about its silence, its stillness, that made her chest tighten instead of soften. "Many say so," Margaret replied, "though few say it as their first thought." Alara noticed, as they drew nearer, a small group of gardeners working near the outer wall, trimming the strange, twisted hedges into even stranger shapes. They stopped their work entirely as the carriage passed, standing perfectly still, watching with expressions Alara could not read at this distance. One of them, an older man leaning on a long-handled shears, bowed his head slightly, not in greeting, she thought, but in something closer to sympathy, as though he pitied whoever sat inside the approaching carriage. "Why do the hedges look like that?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the unsettling image of the bowing gardener. "They are shaped so oddly, nothing like the gardens near my home." "The old Duke favored unusual designs," Margaret explained. "He brought a gardener from a distant country many years ago, a man who shaped hedges into forms said to ward off misfortune. Spirals, knots, shapes without clear beginnings or ends. Some in the village believe they serve a purpose beyond decoration." "And do you believe that?" Margaret allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first Alara had seen from her during the entire journey. "I believe a well-trimmed hedge is pleasant to look at, and I try not to trouble myself with matters beyond my understanding, miss. It has served me well enough these 10 years. The carriage passed through the iron gates, which groaned loudly as they swung open, and rolled up a long gravel path lined with tall, leafless trees. Alara pressed her face closer to the window, trying to see any sign of life within the house, any figure moving behind the glowing windows, but she saw nothing except stillness. When the carriage finally stopped in front of the main entrance, Alara's legs felt unsteady as she stepped down onto the gravel. The air here was colder than she expected, carrying a faint scent of damp stone and something else she could not quite name, something like old candle smoke mixed with dried flowers. A row of servants stood waiting at the base of the wide stone steps, dressed in dark, neat uniforms, their faces carefully composed into polite, unreadable expressions. A tall man stepped forward from among them, his posture straight and formal, his gray hair combed back precisely. "Miss Winters," he said, bowing slightly, "I am Colton, steward of Blackmore Hall. We have been expecting you." "Thank you," Alara said, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the trembling in her hands. "The journey was long." "Indeed," Colton said. "You must be tired. Allow me to show you to your rooms where you may rest before dinner." As they climbed the wide staircase leading into the house, Alara glanced around at her surroundings. The entrance hall was grand, filled with tall portraits of stern-faced men and women whose eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. Heavy curtains covered most of the windows, blocking out what little daylight remained, and the air inside felt thick with silence, broken only by the echo of her own footsteps against the polished floor. "Is the house always this quiet?" she asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. "The Duke prefers a peaceful household," Colton answered smoothly. "You will find that most of the staff have learned to move without unnecessary noise." "And the Duke himself, will I meet him tonight?" Colton's step slowed just slightly before he continued walking. "The Duke keeps a particular schedule. He will meet you before the wedding, of course, but he does not often receive guests in the evening. I am sure you understand." Alara did not understand, not really, but she nodded anyway, sensing that further questions would only be met with more polite evasions. They walked down a long corridor lined with closed doors, until Colton stopped before one near the end and opened it, revealing a spacious bedroom decorated in deep blue and silver tones. A fire already crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room despite the coldness that seemed to live in the walls of the house itself. "This will be your room until the wedding," Colton said. "Margaret will attend to your needs. Dinner will be brought to you this evening, as is customary for guests on their first night." "I will not be joining anyone for dinner," Alara asked, surprised. "Not tonight," Colton said. "There will be time enough for that later." He bowed once more and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Alara stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of wind pressing against the windows. She walked to one of the tall windows and looked out over the estate grounds, where dark gardens stretched into the distance, their hedges trimmed into strange, twisting shapes that seemed almost alive in the fading light. A soft knock came at the door, and Margaret entered carrying a tray of food. "You must be hungry, miss," she said, setting the tray down on a small table near the fire. "Margaret," Alara said, turning from the window, "please be honest with me. What kind of man is the Duke? I have traveled for days without a single true answer, and tomorrow I will marry him." Margaret set down the tray and studied Alara for a long moment, as though weighing how much she dared to say. "The Duke was not always like this," she finally admitted. "I remember him as a young man, before the accident that took his sight. He was lively then, full of laughter, the kind of man who filled a room simply by entering it. And now he keeps to the eastern wing of the house, mostly alone. He rarely speaks to the staff beyond what is necessary. Some say the loss of his sight changed something in him beyond just his eyes." Margaret paused, glancing toward the door as though worried someone might overhear. "But I will say this, miss, I have never known him to be cruel. Distant, yes, sorrowful, certainly, but not cruel. The words offered Alara a small measure of comfort, though they did little to ease the uncertainty pressing against her chest. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Get some rest tonight," Margaret said gently. "Tomorrow will be a long day." After Margaret left, Alara sat by the fire, picking at the food on the tray without much appetite. Her thoughts drifted between her father's desperate face on the morning she left, Beatrice's whispered blessing, and the strange, silent house now surrounding her. She thought of the villagers who had looked away as the carriage passed, of Colton's careful, guarded answers, of Margaret's hesitant honesty. Tomorrow she would stand before a man she had never seen, a man the world called the Blind Duke, and become his wife. She did not know what waited for her beyond the wedding, what kind of life she would build within these dark stone walls, or what secrets the house itself seemed to hold so carefully behind its many closed doors. As the fire burned low and exhaustion finally overtook her fear, Alara climbed into the unfamiliar bed, pulling the heavy blankets around herself. Outside, the wind continued to press against the windows, and somewhere deep within the house, she thought she heard the faint, distant sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, as though someone else in Blackmore Hall was just as unable to sleep as she was. Before sleep finally claimed her, Alara found herself thinking once more of the man she was to marry the following day, trying to piece together some image of him from the scattered fragments Margaret had offered. A young man once full of laughter, now hidden away behind guarded silence and closed doors. A master who paid fair wages and never raised his voice, yet kept walls around himself that no servant, however loyal, had ever managed to cross. She wondered which version of him she would meet tomorrow, and whether either version was closer to the truth than the frightened whispers of villagers who had never once looked him in the eye. The distant pacing she had heard earlier finally quieted, and in the stillness that followed, Alara allowed her thoughts to drift, exhaustion at last outweighing the uneasy curiosity that had followed her every step since entering Blackmore Hall. She closed her eyes, and let the darkness of the house swallow her into an uneasy, dreamless sleep. A scream tore through the hallway just before dawn, sharp and sudden, and Alara sat bolt upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. She listened, frozen, waiting for the sound to come again, but only silence followed, thick and heavy, as though the house itself had swallowed whatever had happened. She threw on a robe and opened her door a crack, peering into the dim corridor. A maid rushed past, her face pale, carrying a bundle of cloth pressed tightly against her chest. She did not notice Alara watching from the doorway. "What happened?" Alara called softly. The maid startled and turned, her eyes wide. "Nothing, miss. A broken vase, that is all. Please go back to sleep. Today is your wedding day, and you must rest." Alara did not believe her, but she also knew there was little use pressing the matter. She closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the pale gray light beginning to creep through the curtains. Whatever had caused that scream, it had not sounded like the shock of a broken vase. It had sounded like fear. By the time the sun had fully risen, the unsettling moment had faded into the background of a day filled with far more immediate concerns. Margaret arrived early, along with two younger maids, carrying an armful of fine fabric that would become Alara's wedding dress. They worked quickly and quietly, pinning and adjusting the gown around her, fastening small pearl buttons down her back, weaving her mother's silver necklace carefully around her throat. "You look lovely, miss," Margaret said, stepping back to admire their work. Alara studied her reflection in the tall mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, dressed in pale silver silk, her dark hair pinned elegantly atop her head, her mother's leaf-shaped pendant resting just below her collarbone. She did not feel like a bride preparing for a joyful occasion. She felt like a girl standing at the edge of an unknown cliff, dressed in her finest clothes before the fall. "Margaret," she said quietly, "who screamed this morning?" The older woman's hands paused for just a moment on the ribbon she was tying. "It was nothing important, miss. Please, do not trouble yourself with it today." "That is the second time you have told me not to trouble myself with something," Alara said. I would rather know the truth, even an unpleasant one, than be kept in comfortable ignorance." Margaret glanced at the two younger maids, who suddenly seemed very interested in smoothing wrinkles out of the dress that had no wrinkles at all. "There was a small accident in the kitchen," Margaret said carefully. "A servant burned her hand quite badly on a pot of boiling water. She was frightened, that is all. It happens sometimes in a house this large with so much work to be done." One of the younger maids, a slight girl with fair hair who had said little throughout the morning, glanced up briefly as Margaret spoke, and for the briefest moment her eyes met Alara's in the mirror. There was something in that glance, quick and nervous, that suggested the story of the burned hand was not the whole truth, though the girl looked away just as quickly, returning her attention to the hem of the gown before Alara could ask her anything directly. "What is your name?" Alara asked her gently, hoping a friendlier approach might loosen whatever the girl seemed to be holding back. "Nora, miss," the girl said softly, not looking up again. "Have you served here long, Nora?" "Since I was 12, miss. My mother worked in the kitchens before me." Nora's hands moved quickly over the fabric, her fingers slightly unsteady. "You need not be nervous," Alara said. "I only wish to understand this house a little better before I am asked to call it home." Nora hesitated, glancing once toward the door before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was not a burn, miss. Sarah cut her hand badly on broken glass in one of the upstairs rooms, not the kitchen. She would not say how the glass came to be broken, only that she was frightened half out of her senses when we found her." Before Alara could ask anything further, Margaret's voice cut in sharply, though not unkindly. "Nora, finish the hem, please. Miss Winters has a long day ahead of her." The girl fell silent immediately, and Alara understood the conversation, for now, had reached its end. It was a plausible explanation, and Alara let it rest, though a small doubt lingered at the back of her mind, refusing to fully disappear. She thought of the maid rushing past with cloth pressed to her chest, the fear so plain on her face. A burn could explain the screams, certainly, but it did not entirely explain the terror she had seen. The ceremony was to take place in a private chapel within the house itself, rather than the village church Alara had expected. Colton escorted her through the quiet corridors, past the same stern portraits that seemed to watch her every step, until they reached a pair of tall wooden doors carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. "The Duke is already inside," Colton said. "Are you ready, Miss Winters?" Alara took a steadying breath, "As ready as I will ever be." The doors opened, and she stepped into a small, candle-lit chapel unlike anything she had imagined. Stone pillars lined either side of a narrow aisle, and stained glass windows, though darkened by the overcast sky outside, still caught fragments of colored light. A handful of servants stood quietly along the walls, and at the far end, near a simple stone altar, stood a tall figure dressed in dark formal clothing. Alara's breath caught in her throat as she walked slowly down the aisle. The man waiting for her stood with careful stillness, his shoulders straight, his hands clasped in front of him. A dark cloth was tied over his eyes, covering the upper half of his face, and even from a distance she could see the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark hair swept back from his forehead. As she drew closer, she noticed something odd. He did not tilt his head toward the sound of her footsteps the way she expected a blind man might, listening for her approach. Instead, he stood facing directly forward, as though he already knew precisely where she would appear, precisely when she would arrive beside him. She noticed, too, the small number of guests scattered among the pews, fewer than she would have expected even for a private ceremony. A handful of household staff, Colton standing rigid near the front, and no family members at all, not on either side. No aunts or uncles from her own scattered, dwindling family, no cousins or distant relations from the Vane side either. It struck her as strange that a man of such wealth and title would marry with so little witness from his own bloodline, though given everything else about this house that defied ordinary expectation, she supposed she should not have been surprised. She reached the altar and stood beside him, and for the first time he turned his head toward her. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a warmth she had not expected. Thank you for making the long journey here. Your Grace, she replied, unsure of what else to say. The ceremony itself passed quickly, a series of formal words spoken by an elderly priest who seemed as reluctant to linger in the house as everyone else appeared to be. Alara repeated her vows in a clear, steady voice, surprising herself with how calm she managed to sound despite the storm of uncertainty swirling inside her. When it came time for Ashford to speak his own vows, his voice remained gentle, almost tender, each word chosen with careful deliberation. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, Ashford reached for her hand, and Alara noticed his fingers found hers without hesitation, without the small searching motions she might have expected from a man who could not see. His grip was warm and steady, and for a brief moment she felt something unexpected pass between them, not quite comfort, but perhaps the beginning of it. You must be tired from the ceremony, Ashford said as they walked slowly back down the aisle together, his hand resting lightly on her arm. There will be a small dinner tonight, just the two of us. I hope that will not disappoint you. I did not expect a large celebration, Alara admitted. Given the circumstances. Something flickered across his expression there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. No, he said quietly, I suppose you did not. That evening, Alara was led to a private dining room on the upper floor of the house, smaller and warmer than the grand halls she had passed through earlier. A table had been set for two, candles casting soft golden light across fine china and polished silverware. Ashford was already seated when she arrived, the dark cloth still covering his eyes, his posture relaxed in a way that seemed at odds with the tension she had sensed radiating from every other corner of the house. Please sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him with a precision that again struck her as unusual. She sat down carefully, studying him in the candlelight. Up close, she could see faint scars along his temple, disappearing beneath the edge of the cloth covering his eyes, evidence of whatever accident had taken his sight so many years ago. I imagine you have many questions, Ashford said, breaking the silence between them. I have more questions than I know how to ask, Alara admitted honestly. He allowed a small, tired smile. Then let us begin with the simplest ones. Ask, and I will answer as truthfully as I am able. Alara considered for a moment. How did you lose your sight? His smile faded slightly. An accident many years ago. I was young, foolish, and careless with people I should not have trusted. The details are not pleasant, and I would rather not dwell on them tonight, if you do not mind. It was a fair enough answer, though it told her very little. Why did you choose to marry someone you have never met? Surely a man of your position could have found a wife through more traditional means. Perhaps, Ashford said carefully, but traditional means often come with expectations I am not prepared to fulfill. A woman who marries me under different circumstances would expect a husband who attends social gatherings, who introduces her to fashionable society, who lives the kind of life expected of a duke. I cannot offer that life. I thought it fairer to be honest about my limitations from the very beginning, and to choose a match based on need rather than false promises. Tell me something about the house, then, Alara said, deciding to set aside her sharper questions for a moment. Something ordinary. What is your favorite room if a man in your position is permitted to have such a thing? For the first time that evening, Ashford's expression relaxed into something closer to genuine ease. The library in the West Wing, he said. It has tall windows facing the morning sun, and shelves my grandfather filled long before I was born. I spend more hours there than anywhere else in this house. You read a great deal then, Alara said, for a man who cannot see the pages. A flicker of something crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she nearly missed it. I have a servant who reads to me, he said smoothly. It is not the same as reading with one's own eyes, but I have grown accustomed to it over the years. That must be lonely, Alara said, relying so completely on the voice of another. One learns to find comfort in unexpected places, Ashford replied, and something in his tone suggested the conversation, pleasant as it was, had drifted closer to a truth he was not yet ready to share. Alara studied him carefully as he spoke. There was something practiced about his words, something that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, though she could not say exactly why she felt that way. "And my father's debts were simply a convenient solution to your problem," she said, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. Ashford's expression softened. "I understand if you resent the arrangement. I would resent it too in your position. But I promise you, Alara, whatever else may be true about this house, about me, I did not intend to bring you here as a prisoner or a possession. I hope, in time, you might come to see this as something other than a punishment." His words, gentle and sincere, caught her off guard. She had expected coldness, perhaps even cruelty, given everything the villagers' fearful glances and Margaret's careful warnings had suggested. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a man who spoke with quiet thoughtfulness, who seemed genuinely concerned with her comfort despite the strange circumstances surrounding their marriage. "May I ask you something in return?" Ashford said. "Of course. Are you afraid of me?" The question surprised her with its directness. She considered lying, offering some polite reassurance, but something about the honesty in his voice made her want to answer truthfully instead. "I do not know you well enough yet to be afraid of you specifically," she said carefully. "But I am afraid of this house, and of everything I do not understand about it." Ashford nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "That is fair," he said, "and I hope over time to help you understand more, though some things may take longer to explain than others." Dinner continued in a strange, careful rhythm, Alara asking small questions about the house, the grounds, the daily routine she would be expected to follow, and Ashford answering each one with patient, measured responses. By the time the meal ended, she felt slightly less like a stranger dropped into an unfamiliar world, though the underlying tension of everything left unspoken still hummed quietly beneath the surface of their conversation. As a servant cleared away the final dishes, Ashford rose from his seat. "It has been a long day," he said. "You should rest. Tomorrow I will show you more of the house myself if you are willing." "I would like that," Alara said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. He walked her back to her chambers, his hand resting lightly on her arm as they moved through the quiet corridors. At her door he paused. "Alara," he said softly, "whatever you may hear about me, about this house, I ask only that you give me the chance to show you the truth yourself, rather than believing every whispered rumor along the way." "I will try," she said. He inclined his head slightly, then turned and walked away down the corridor, his steps sure and steady, never once faltering or reaching out to touch the walls for guidance, the way she imagined a blind man surely would in an unfamiliar hallway. Alara stood at her door, watching him disappear into the shadows, and the small doubt she had felt since arriving at Blackmore Hall grew slightly larger, settling deep into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Something about her new husband did not add up, though she could not yet say precisely what it was. She entered her room and closed the door softly behind her, leaning against it for a long moment as she replayed the evening in her mind. Ashford's gentle words, his careful movements, the strange confidence in his steps, the scars along his temple that told a story he refused to fully share. And beneath it all, the memory of that morning's scream, quickly explained away, but never quite convincing. Tonight, she thought, would be her true wedding night, and whatever waited for her behind the next closed door might finally begin to answer the questions that had followed her every step since leaving her father's house. She changed slowly into her night clothes, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm, and waited, listening to the quiet creak of the house settling around her, for whatever would come next. The door to her chamber opened without a knock, and Alara spun around so quickly that her candle nearly toppled from its holder. Ashford stood in the doorway, his tall frame outlined by the dim light of the corridor behind him, the dark cloth still tied over his eyes. "Forgive me," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I should have knocked. I forget sometimes that others cannot hear me approaching the way I hear myself." "It is your house," Alara said, though her heart pounded loudly in her chest. You need not ask permission to enter your own wife's chamber. He crossed the room slowly, his steps measured and precise, and stopped a short distance from where she stood near the fireplace. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, casting shifting shadows across the walls, and Alara found herself studying him closely, searching for any small sign of what might come next. I owe you an explanation, Ashford said finally, his voice quieter than it had been at dinner. Several explanations, in truth, but tonight I think it is time you saw something I have kept hidden from nearly everyone in this house. Alara's breath caught. What do you mean? Ashford reached up slowly and untied the dark cloth covering his eyes. Alara watched, frozen, as the fabric fell away from his face, and beneath it, two dark eyes opened and looked directly at her, clear and sharp, focused entirely on her face with an intensity that made her step backward instinctively. You can see, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Yes, Ashford said quietly. For a long moment, Alara could not speak at all. Her mind raced backward through everything she had witnessed since arriving at Blackmore Hall, his sure steps through unfamiliar corridors, the way his hand had found hers without hesitation during the ceremony, the way he had faced her directly even before she spoke. All the small details that had troubled her without her fully understanding why suddenly arranged themselves into a clear and unsettling picture. She thought suddenly of Nora's frightened whisper about broken glass, of the scream that had torn through the house before dawn on her wedding day, of Margaret's careful, guarded warnings offered again and again throughout the journey. Every strange detail she had brushed aside as nerves or exhaustion now seemed to circle back toward this single, staggering revelation, and she felt almost foolish for not seeing it sooner, for allowing herself to be so thoroughly deceived by a simple piece of cloth. You lied to me, she said, her voice shaking now, anger beginning to rise beneath the shock. You lied to my father, to the priest, to everyone. Yes, Ashford said again, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only a heavy, tired honesty. I did. Why? Alara demanded, backing further away from him until she felt the cool stone of the wall against her shoulders. Why would you pretend to be blind? What kind of man deceives an entire household, an entire village for years? Ashford's dark eyes remained fixed on her, and she saw something in them she had not expected. Not cruelty, not amusement at her distress, but something closer to sorrow. A man who has very good reasons for needing the world to believe he cannot see, he said quietly. Reasons I intend to explain to you if you will allow me the chance. You should have explained before the wedding, Alara said, her voice rising. Before I stood at that altar and made promises to a man wearing a lie over his face. You are right, Ashford admitted. I should have. I am sorry for that more than you know. But some truths are dangerous to speak aloud too quickly, even to the person most entitled to hear them. Dangerous? Alara repeated, the word sending a fresh wave of unease through her chest. What do you mean, dangerous? Ashford ran a hand through his dark hair, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked less like a composed nobleman and more like a man carrying an exhausting weight on his shoulders. There are people, he said carefully, who believe I truly lost my sight many years ago. People who have built plans around that belief, who feel safe because they think I cannot see them clearly, cannot recognize their faces, cannot testify to what I witnessed on the night my family nearly lost everything. Alara stared at him, her anger momentarily overtaken by confusion. What are you talking about? What night? Ashford walked slowly to the window, looking out at the dark gardens below, his back to her now. 6 years ago, my father died under circumstances that were never properly explained. Officially, it was recorded as an illness. In truth, I believe he was harmed by someone close to our family, someone who benefited greatly from his death. I was present that night. I saw things I should not have seen. And shortly after, I suffered an accident of my own, one that left these scars along my temple and gave me the perfect excuse to disappear from the world entirely. You are saying someone tried to harm you as well, Alara said slowly, piecing together the fragments of his story. I am saying I allowed the world to believe I had lost far more than I actually did, Ashford said, turning back to face her. By playing the role of a blind, broken man, hidden away from society, I removed myself as a threat to whoever caused my father's death. As long as they believe I cannot see, cannot identify them, cannot testify against them, I remain safe. And so does anyone connected to me. The weight of his words settled slowly over Alara, and despite her lingering anger, she found herself unable to deny the fear evident in his voice, the genuine exhaustion behind his carefully composed expression. "And what does this have to do with me?" she asked. "Why involve me in this at all? Why not simply continue your quiet, hidden life alone?" Ashford hesitated, and for a moment, Alara thought he might refuse to answer. "There have been signs recently that the person responsible for my father's death is growing suspicious," he said finally. "Questions being asked, old wounds being reopened. I needed a wife, someone the household and the wider world would see as ordinary, unremarkable, unconnected to the darker matters surrounding this family. A marriage arranged through simple financial need, rather than personal choice, draws far less suspicion than one built on any other foundation." Alara felt a cold anger settle in her stomach, sharper now than her earlier shock. "So I am not simply a bride to you. I am a shield, a piece to be placed carefully on a board to protect you from whatever danger you have brought upon yourself." "That is not entirely fair," Ashford said, though he did not fully deny it either. "Is it not?" Alara's voice cracked with frustration. "You have told me nothing true since I arrived here except tonight, when you finally decided the truth was convenient for your purposes. How am I to trust a single word you say now?" Ashford crossed the room and stood before her, close enough that she could see the genuine regret written plainly across his features. "You are right to be angry," he said. "I have given you every reason to distrust me, but I am asking you now, honestly, for the first time since you arrived, to trust me a little longer. Not because I have earned it, but because your safety and mine may depend on it." "Does anyone in this house know the truth?" Alara asked. "Colton, Margaret, or have you deceived them as thoroughly as you deceived me?" "Only Colton knows," Ashford said. "He has served this family since before my father's death, and his loyalty is beyond question. The rest of the household, including Margaret, believed the same story as the rest of the world. It was safer that way, for them as much as for me. A secret known by fewer people is a secret far less likely to slip free." "And the girl Nora," Alara said, remembering the frightened whisper from that morning. "There was an incident before the wedding, a scream, broken glass. Was that connected to any of this?" Ashford's expression tightened. "I do not know the details of that incident myself, though I intend to find out. If someone within this house is already testing its defenses, we have less time than I hoped to prepare." "My safety," Alara repeated, alarm sharpening her voice. "What danger have you placed me in by marrying me?" "None, I hope, if we are careful," Ashford said. "But the man I believe responsible for my father's death is not someone who forgives loose threads easily. If he begins to suspect that my blindness is a performance, if he begins to wonder why I chose to marry so suddenly, so quietly, he may look more closely at both of us than either of us would wish." Alara sank slowly into the chair near the fireplace, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. The evening had begun with careful, gentle conversation over dinner, and had unraveled into something far more dangerous and complicated than she could have imagined. She thought of her father, of Beatrice, of the quiet life she had left behind, and wondered bitterly whether she had traded one kind of danger for another entirely different, and perhaps far more perilous, kind. "You should have told me all of this before I agreed to marry you," she said quietly, the anger in her voice giving way to something closer to exhaustion. "I know," Ashford said, kneeling beside her chair so that his eyes met hers directly. "And I am sorry for the position I have placed you in. If you wish, I will find a way to release you from this marriage, to send you somewhere safe, away from whatever danger may follow me. I will not force you to remain here against your will, not after deceiving you so thoroughly already." Alara studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity in his offer, but found only quiet sincerity staring back at her. It would have been easy in that moment to accept his offer, to demand passage away from Blackmore Hall and back to whatever remained of her old life. And yet, she found herself hesitating, thinking of her father's debts, now paid, of Beatrice's safety, secured by this very marriage, of the strange, unwilling curiosity that had begun to form despite everything, about the truth behind Ashford Vane and the danger surrounding him. "If I leave," she said slowly, "what happens to my father's debts, to the arrangement that saved my family from ruin?" "The debts remain paid, regardless of your choice," Ashford said firmly. "I will not use your family's misfortune as leverage to keep you here against your wishes. Whatever happens between us tonight, that promise stands unchanged." His answer, offered so plainly and without hesitation, eased something in Alara's chest, even as the larger uncertainty of her situation remained unresolved. "Then let me think," she said. "Let me have tonight to consider what you have told me before I decide anything further." "Of course," Ashford said, rising to his feet. "Take whatever time you need." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite name. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "I am glad it was you standing beside me today, deception and all. Whatever you decide, I do not regret that much at least." He left the room, closing the door softly behind him, and Alara sat alone by the dying fire, turning his words over and over in her mind alongside everything else she had learned that night. The blind Duke was not blind at all, and the marriage she had entered under her father's desperate arrangement had revealed itself to be something far more dangerous, far more uncertain, than she had ever imagined possible. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows once more, and somewhere within the depths of Blackmore Hall, she thought she heard, faintly, the sound of a door closing far away, followed by silence that felt heavier and more watchful than before. A carriage arrived at Blackmore Hall 3 days later, its wheels crunching loudly against the gravel path, and the sound alone was enough to send a ripple of tension through the entire household. Alara watched from her window as Colton hurried down the front steps, his usually calm posture stiff and hurried, to greet a man stepping down from the carriage below. The visitor was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive dark coat that marked him as a man of considerable means. He moved with an easy, confident stride, the kind that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. Alara could not hear the words exchanged between him and Colton, but she could see the stiffness in the steward's shoulders, the careful, guarded way he gestured toward the house. She hurried from her room and found Margaret in the corridor, folding fresh linens with quick, nervous movements. "Who is that man?" Alara asked. Margaret glanced toward the window before answering, lowering her voice as though the visitor might somehow hear her from the grounds below. "That is Gerald Ashcombe, miss, a cousin of the late Duke, the Duke's father. He visits from time to time, though never with much warning." "Does the Duke expect him?" "I do not believe so," Margaret admitted. "His visits are rarely welcome, though they are always tolerated. Mr. Ashcombe holds a certain influence in matters concerning the family estate." Alara thought back to the conversation she had shared with Ashford 3 nights earlier, his mention of a man who had likely caused his father's death, a man who remained suspicious and dangerous even now. She wondered, with a growing sense of unease, whether Gerald Ashcombe might be exactly the man Ashford feared. She made her way toward the main staircase, drawn by curiosity despite the small voice in the back of her mind urging caution. From the landing above the entrance hall, she could see Ashford standing near the base of the stairs, the dark cloth once again tied carefully over his eyes, his posture deliberately more hesitant than she now knew it needed to be. Gerald Ashcombe stood before him, studying him with an expression Alara could not quite read. "Ashford," Gerald said, his voice smooth and warm, though something beneath the warmth felt calculated. "I heard the news of your marriage rather late, I am afraid. You might have sent word to your own family." "Forgive me, cousin," Ashford said, his voice carrying the same careful, halting quality Alara remembered from their wedding, so different from the steady, confident tone he had used once they were alone. Matters were arranged quickly, given my circumstances. I did not wish to trouble you with the details of a marriage born from financial necessity, rather than celebration. Gerald's gaze drifted upward toward the staircase, and Alara stepped back quickly, though not quickly enough to avoid his attention entirely. "And is that your new bride I see, watching from above?" he called out, a note of amusement in his voice. Alara felt her face flush with embarrassment, caught so plainly eavesdropping, but she forced herself to descend the remaining stairs with as much composure as she could manage. "Mr. Ashcombe," she said, offering a polite curtsy as she reached the entrance hall. "Forgive my curiosity. Visitors are rare at Blackmore Hall." "No need to apologize, my dear," Gerald said, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. "Curiosity is a natural trait, and a rather charming one in a woman as young as yourself. Tell me, how do you find married life with my cousin so far?" "It is still quite new," Alara said carefully. "I am learning the rhythms of the house." Of course. Gerald's smile widened slightly, though it did not reach his eyes. "Ashford has always kept a rather unusual household. I trust the staff have made your adjustment as smooth as possible." Alara glanced toward Ashford, whose expression remained carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the tension she now knew must be simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Everyone has been very kind," she said. Gerald's attention lingered on her for a moment longer before shifting back to Ashford. "I had hoped to discuss some matters of the estate with you, cousin, while I am here. Certain financial arrangements that require your signature." "Of course," Ashford said. "Shall we speak in the study?" As the two men moved toward a nearby corridor, Gerald paused and looked back at Alara one final time. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Vane. I am certain we will see much more of each other in the future." There was something in the way he said it, something that felt less like a polite farewell and more like a quiet promise, or perhaps a warning. And Alara stood frozen in the entrance hall long after the two men had disappeared down the corridor, an uneasy chill settling deep into her bones. Later that afternoon, as she wandered the halls trying to settle her nerves, she came upon Colton standing near the window of an empty sitting room, watching Gerald's carriage depart down the long gravel drive. His usual composed expression had slipped slightly, replaced by something guarded and watchful. "You do not care for Mr. Ashcombe," Alara observed, stepping into the room. Colton turned quickly, straightening at once. "It is not my place to hold opinions of the Duke's family, Mrs. Vane." "And yet you were watching his carriage with a great deal of attention for a man with no opinion," Alara pressed gently. The steward hesitated, weighing his words carefully, as he always seemed to do. "I have served this house for many years," he said finally. "I served the late Duke before his son, and I watched Mr. Ashcombe's visits grow more frequent in the years before that tragedy. I will say only this, Mrs. Vane. Trust is a fragile thing in this household, and I would advise you to extend it carefully, to anyone, myself included, until you have had time to judge for yourself where it is deserved." It was the most direct thing Colton had said to her since her arrival, and Alara found herself both grateful for the honesty and unsettled by what it implied. "Thank you, Colton," she said. "I will remember that." He gave a small, formal bow and excused himself, leaving Alara alone with her thoughts once more, the uneasy chill from earlier settling even deeper into her chest. That evening, Ashford came to her chambers again, his eyes uncovered now that they were alone, though his expression carried a weariness Alara had not seen in him before. "I apologize for Gerald's visit," he said, sinking into a chair near the fireplace. "His timing, as always, could not have been worse." "Is he the man you spoke of?" Alara asked directly. "The one you believe responsible for your father's death?" Ashford hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I have no proof, not yet, but every instinct I possess tells me Gerald orchestrated my father's death, and very likely arranged the accident that gave me the excuse to hide behind this blindness in the first place." "What does he gain from your father's death?" Alara asked. "What does he gain from your isolation?" "Control," Ashford said simply. My father held significant influence over certain business dealings that Gerald wished to control entirely for himself. With my father gone, and myself removed from active involvement in the estate's affairs due to my supposed blindness, Gerald has managed those dealings largely unchallenged for the past 6 years. And now, Elara pressed, why visit so suddenly after so much time has passed? Ashford's jaw tightened. I do not know for certain. Perhaps my marriage has raised questions in his mind. Perhaps he wonders why a man content to hide away for 6 years would suddenly seek a wife. Or perhaps it is simply coincidence, and I am allowing fear to shape shadows where none truly exist. Elara studied him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes that suggested sleepless nights and constant vigilance. You do not believe it is coincidence, she said. No, Ashford admitted quietly, I do not. Over the following days, Elara found herself watching the household with new eyes, noticing details she might have previously overlooked. She observed the way certain servants seemed to avoid mentioning Gerald Ashcombe's name entirely, the way Colton grew visibly tense whenever letters arrived bearing a particular seal, the way Margaret's careful, guarded warnings from her very first day at Blackmore Hall now made far more sense than they had before. She found Margaret again that evening, folding linens in the small room where she often worked, and could not resist asking one more question that had lingered in her mind since witnessing Gerald's visit. Margaret, did you know the late Duke well? Margaret's hands paused briefly over the fabric. I did, miss. A kind man, generous with the staff, quick to laugh despite the weight of his responsibilities. His death struck this household hard, harder than I think anyone outside these walls truly understood. Do you believe it was truly an illness that took him? The older woman was quiet for a long moment. I have wondered over the years why a man in such robust health should fall so suddenly and so completely. I never spoke my doubts aloud, not even to Colton, because doubts without proof can bring more danger than silence ever could. But I will tell you, miss, since you ask so directly, that I never fully believed the explanation given at the time. Elara felt a chill settle over her at this quiet confirmation of everything Ashford had suspected. Why did you never speak of it? Because a servant who asks too many questions in a house like this rarely keeps her position for long, Margaret said simply. And because I had no proof, only instinct, and instinct alone rarely convinces anyone of anything. The conversation left Elara with even more to consider, and she found herself watching the household with sharper eyes over the following days, gathering small observations the way one gathers pieces of a larger puzzle, uncertain yet of the full picture they might eventually form. One afternoon, while exploring the eastern wing of the house at Ashford's invitation, Elara noticed a locked door at the end of a narrow corridor, different from the others in the house, reinforced with iron bands and a heavy lock that seemed far more serious than the simple latches used elsewhere. What is behind that door? She asked. Ashford's expression grew guarded. My father's private study, he said. It has remained locked since his death. I have not yet found the strength to go through his belongings properly. May I ask why the lock seems so much stronger than the others in the house? Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Because within that room are documents I believe hold evidence of Gerald's wrongdoing, evidence I have not yet had the courage or opportunity to fully examine, for fear of what confirming my suspicions might mean for both of us. Elara felt a spark of determination ignite within her chest, cutting through the fear and uncertainty that had followed her since arriving at Blackmore Hall. Then let us examine it together, she said. If there is truth hidden behind that door, hiding from it will not make us any safer. Ashford looked at her with an expression of surprise, followed quickly by something that looked almost like gratitude. You would help me with this. After everything I have kept from you, after the danger I have already placed you in simply by bringing you into this house. I am your wife now, whether either of us fully chose that path or not, Elara said firmly. If danger follows this family, it follows me as well, whether I involve myself directly or not. I would rather face it with clear eyes than hide from it in ignorance." Something shifted in Ashford's expression, a warmth Alara had not seen from him before, mixed with clear respect for the resolve in her voice. "Very well," he said. "Tomorrow night, when the household has settled and Gerald has returned to his own estate, we will open my father's study together and see what truths have been waiting there for 6 long years." That night, Alara lay awake long after the candles had burned low, turning over everything she had learned since her arrival at Blackmore Hall. She thought of her father's desperate arrangement, of the debts now paid through a marriage built on deception, and danger far greater than she had ever imagined. She thought of Gerald Ashcombe's calculating smile, of the locked door waiting at the end of the eastern corridor, of Ashford's careful, guarded eyes finally beginning to trust her with the truth. Whatever waited behind that locked door, she understood now that there was no simple path back to the quiet, uncertain life she had left behind. She had married into danger, into secrets far larger and more dangerous than a simple arrangement between a desperate father and a wealthy duke. And though fear still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, she found, to her own surprise, a growing sense of purpose taking root alongside it. Tomorrow night, she would help uncover truths that had remained hidden for 6 long years, truths that might finally explain the death of Ashford's father, the deception surrounding his supposed blindness, and the dangerous game now unfolding around them both within the dark stone walls of Blackmore Hall. She closed her eyes at last, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, she did not dream of fear or uncertainty, but of locked doors slowly opening, and long-hidden truths finally stepping into the light. Somewhere deep within her, a resolve was hardening that had not existed a week earlier, when she had arrived at Blackmore Hall as little more than a frightened stranger handed over to settle a debt. She was no longer simply a bride caught in circumstances beyond her control. She had become, without quite intending it, a partner in uncovering a truth that had waited 6 long years for someone brave enough to finally look for it. Whatever tomorrow night revealed behind that locked door, she intended to face it clearly without flinching, for her own sake as much as for Ashford's. The lock broke apart with a sharp metallic crack that seemed impossibly loud in the silent corridor, and Alara froze, listening for any sign that the sound had carried through the sleeping house. Beside her, Ashford held the small iron tool he had used to force the ancient mechanism, his own breath held tight in his chest as they waited. No footsteps came. No voices called out. The house remained as still and silent as it had been every night since Alara's arrival, and after a long moment, Ashford exhaled slowly and pushed the heavy door open, revealing a room untouched by light or movement for 6 long years. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed for the first time in years as the door swung inward, and Alara raised the small lantern she carried to illuminate the space before them. A large desk sat near the center of the room, its surface covered in papers yellowed with age, and tall shelves lined the walls, filled with books and boxes that had not been touched since the late Duke's death. "This was his study," Ashford said quietly, stepping inside with visible hesitation, as though the room itself might somehow judge him for the years he had spent avoiding it. "I have not set foot in here since the funeral." Alara moved carefully around the room, running her fingers lightly across the dusty spines of old books, feeling the weight of history pressing down on the space around her. "Where should we begin?" she asked. Ashford moved toward the large desk, his hands hovering over the scattered papers before finally settling on a locked drawer near the bottom. "My father kept his most important documents here," he said. "Business dealings, private letters, anything he did not wish others to easily discover." Together they worked to open the drawer, using the same small tool that had broken the door's lock, and after several tense minutes, the mechanism finally gave way. Inside, they found a thick bundle of letters, tied together with faded ribbon, along with several ledgers filled with careful, precise handwriting. Alara untied the ribbon carefully and began reading through the letters, while Ashford turned his attention to the ledgers, scanning columns of numbers and notations with growing intensity. The candlelight flickered across their faces as the minutes passed, silence broken only by the soft rustle of aging paper. Ashford, Elara said suddenly, holding up one of the letters, her voice tight with excitement. Look at this. He crossed the room quickly and took the letter from her hands, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The letter was addressed to Ashford's father, written in a hand Elara did not recognize, discussing a business arrangement involving significant sums of money tied to shipping contracts along the northern coast. But it was the final paragraph that had caught her attention, a thinly veiled threat suggesting that certain matters would need to be resolved permanently if the late Duke continued to refuse a particular proposal. This is Gerald's handwriting, Ashford said, his voice hardening. I would recognize it anywhere. He wrote to my father threatening him less than a month before his death. Elara moved to the tall bookshelf lining the far wall, running her fingers along the spines of old ledgers stacked haphazardly among leather-bound books that looked as though they had not been opened in decades. One volume, thinner than the others and tucked behind a row of larger books, caught her attention, its cover worn soft with handling despite its hidden placement. She pulled it free and opened it carefully, finding not business records but what appeared to be a personal journal, written in the same careful hand that had signed several of the letters they had already found. Ashford, she said quietly, I believe this belonged to your father. He crossed the room and took the journal from her hands, his expression shifting as he recognized the handwriting immediately. I did not know he kept a journal, he murmured, turning the pages with visible reverence. The entries, dated across the final months of the late Duke's life, spoke of growing unease regarding Gerald's increasing demands, of sleepless nights spent worrying over the shipping contracts Gerald wished to control, and of a final, troubling entry made only 3 days before his death, describing a private meeting arranged at Gerald's insistence, at a location away from the house, where witnesses would be scarce. He knew, Ashford said softly, his voice heavy with something between grief and vindication. He knew Gerald meant him harm, and he went to that meeting anyway. Perhaps he believed he could reason with him, Elara offered gently. Family often clings to hope longer than sense would advise. Ashford closed the journal carefully, holding it against his chest for a long moment before setting it beside the letters in his satchel. There must be more, Elara said, reaching for another letter, and another, the two of them working quickly now through the remaining bundle, piecing together a pattern that grew clearer with each passing document. Gerald Ashcombe had been pressuring Ashford's father for years to hand over control of the family's shipping and trading interests that generated substantial wealth through contracts along several important coastal routes. The late Duke had resisted, again and again, despite escalating pressure and increasingly pointed threats. Here, Ashford said, holding up a final letter dated just 2 weeks before his father's death. Listen to this. He read aloud, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. If you continue to refuse me what is rightfully owed, you will leave me no choice but to take matters into my own hands. I have been patient long enough, and my patience has limits even for family. Elara felt a cold certainty settle over her, confirming everything Ashford had suspected but never been able to prove. This is enough to condemn him, she said. Surely, with this evidence, you could bring these letters before the proper authorities. Ashford's expression, however, remained troubled rather than triumphant. These letters prove Gerald threatened my father, he said slowly. They do not prove he carried out those threats. A skilled lawyer could argue these are simply the frustrated words of an ambitious man, nothing more. Gerald has powerful connections throughout the region, judges and officials who owe him favors accumulated over many years. Without stronger proof, these letters alone may not be enough. Perhaps the journal changes matters, Elara suggested. A private diary, written without any intention of being read by others, carries a different weight than letters exchanged between two men who might have anticipated future scrutiny. Your father's own words, describing his fear so plainly, might convince a magistrate where the letters alone could not. Ashford considered this carefully. It may help, yes. Combined with the letters, and perhaps testimony from those who witnessed Gerald's behavior in the months before my father's death, we might build something substantial enough to act upon. But we will need to move carefully. Gerald has spent 6 years believing himself safe from suspicion. If he senses we are gathering evidence against him, he will not hesitate to protect himself by whatever means necessary. Then what would be enough? Alara asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Before Ashford could answer, a floorboard creaked sharply somewhere outside the study door, and both of them froze instantly, their eyes meeting in shared alarm. Ashford moved quickly, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the room into near-total darkness, broken only by faint moonlight filtering through a single narrow window. They stood in tense silence, listening as footsteps moved slowly down the corridor outside, pausing, it seemed, directly in front of the study door. Alara's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might somehow be heard through the thick wooden walls. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally continued past, fading gradually into the distance until silence returned once more. "That could have been anyone," Alara whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. "Perhaps," Ashford whispered back. "But we should not linger here any longer than necessary." He carefully gathered the letters and ledgers, tucking them into a leather satchel he had brought for this purpose. "We will study these more carefully tomorrow, somewhere safer than this room." They slipped quietly from the study, Ashford relocking the broken mechanism as best he could to disguise their intrusion, and made their way back through the dark corridors toward Alara's chambers. Neither spoke until they were safely inside, the door closed firmly behind them. "Who do you think was in the corridor?" Alara asked, sinking into a chair near the dying fire, exhaustion and adrenaline both pulling at her in equal measure. "I do not know," Ashford admitted. "It could have been any member of the household, unable to sleep, wandering for reasons entirely unrelated to us. Or it could have been someone watching this house more closely than we realized." The thought sent a fresh chill through Alara's chest. "Do you believe Gerald has spies within Blackmore Hall itself?" Ashford's expression grew grim. "I have long suspected it, though I have never been able to identify who among the staff might be loyal to him rather than to me. It would explain a great deal, however, including how he seems to always know precisely when to visit, precisely what questions to ask." Alara thought of the servants she had encountered since her arrival, the guarded expressions, the careful, measured answers to even simple questions. Any one of them, she realized with growing unease, could be reporting her every movement, every conversation, directly to the man responsible for Ashford's father's death. "We must be careful, then," she said, "about what we say and to whom, even within these walls." "Yes," Ashford agreed. "From this point forward, we trust no one beyond what is absolutely necessary, until we know for certain where true loyalties lie." Over the following days, Alara found herself watching the household staff with renewed suspicion, studying small details she had previously overlooked. She noticed that Margaret seemed to grow tense whenever Colton entered a room unexpectedly, that certain younger servants exchanged quick, knowing glances whenever Gerald Ashcombe's name arose in conversation. She could not be certain who among them might be loyal to the family, and who might be quietly serving darker interests. Late one evening, as she sat with Ashford reviewing the ledgers they had recovered from his father's study, a soft knock came at the door. Both of them tensed instinctively, exchanging a wary glance before Ashford called out, asking who sought entrance. "It is only me, Your Grace," came Margaret's familiar voice from the corridor. "I have brought fresh tea as requested." Ashford relaxed slightly, though not entirely, and gestured for Alara to conceal the ledgers beneath a nearby cushion before allowing Margaret to enter. The older woman set down the tea tray with her usual quiet efficiency, though Alara noticed her eyes flicker briefly toward the satchel resting near Ashford's chair, a satchel that had clearly not been present in this room before. "Will there be anything else tonight, Your Grace?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No, thank you, Margaret," Ashford said. "That will be all." After she left, closing the door softly behind her, Alara turned to Ashford with concern etched clearly across her features. "Do you think she noticed the satchel?" "Perhaps," Ashford admitted. "Margaret has served this family faithfully for many years. I want to believe her loyalty remains genuine, but I cannot be entirely certain of anyone's true intentions any longer, not even those I have known the longest." The uncertainty hung heavily in the air between them, a reminder that danger no longer felt distant or abstract, but had settled itself firmly within the very walls meant to shelter them. Alara thought of the locked study, the threatening letters, the footsteps in the corridor that might have belonged to anyone, or perhaps to someone with far more sinister purposes. Whatever safety she had hoped to find within her marriage to Ashford Vane had proven itself, again and again, to be far more fragile and complicated than she could have ever anticipated. And as she prepared for bed that night, glancing toward the shadows gathering in the corners of her chamber, she found herself wondering, with growing unease, just how much longer they could continue uncovering dangerous truths before those truths began uncovering them in return. She thought of the late Duke's final journal entry, the quiet dread evident in every carefully written word. A man who had sensed danger closing in around him and walked toward it anyway, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of a stubborn hope that reason might still prevail over greed. She wondered whether Ashford carried that same stubbornness within him, that same willingness to walk toward danger for the sake of truth, and whether she herself now carried a measure of it too, having chosen, freely, to stand beside him in uncovering what 6 years of careful silence had failed to reveal. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it carried with it uneasy dreams of locked doors and distant footsteps, of letters written in threatening hands, and of a house that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. Glass shattered somewhere below, followed instantly by a sharp cry of pain, and Alara bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering as she scrambled toward the door. The corridor outside was already filled with hurried voices and the flickering glow of hastily lit candles, servants rushing past in states of half-dress, confusion etched across every face she passed. She found Ashford near the top of the main staircase, his expression tense as he questioned a young stable hand who stood trembling before him, his sleeve torn and stained dark with blood. "What happened?" Ashford demanded. "Someone was in the stables, Your Grace," the young man said, his voice shaking. "I heard noises and went to investigate. A man attacked me, though I could not see his face clearly in the darkness. He fled when I called for help, but not before." He gestured weakly toward his injured arm. "Fetch the physician immediately," Ashford instructed Colton, who had appeared at the base of the stairs. "And have the grounds searched thoroughly. I want to know if anything was taken or if anyone else was harmed." Alara knelt briefly beside the young stable hand while they waited for the physician, offering what comfort she could as he sat trembling on the bottom step. "Can you tell me anything more about the man who attacked you?" she asked gently. "Any detail at all might help us understand who did this." The young man thought hard, his brow furrowed with effort despite his obvious pain. "He was tall, miss, taller than most, and he wore a ring on his hand. I felt it when he struck me, a heavy ring with some kind of stone set into it. I could not see its color in the dark, but I felt its shape clearly enough." Alara filed the detail away carefully, though she said nothing of her growing suspicion that such a ring might belong to a man of considerable wealth and standing, a man who had visited Blackmore Hall only days earlier wearing rings on nearly every finger. As the household scrambled to respond, Ashford turned to Alara, his expression grave. "This is no coincidence," he said quietly, drawing her aside from the commotion. "Gerald has grown bolder since our discovery in my father's study." "You believe this was his doing?" Alara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I believe someone was searching for something in the stables tonight, and I do not believe it was simple theft," Ashford said. "Perhaps they hoped to find evidence of our activities, or perhaps this was meant as a warning, a demonstration that we are being watched more closely than we realized." The search of the grounds turned up little beyond scattered footprints leading toward the outer wall, footprints that vanished entirely once they reached the harder ground beyond the estate's boundary. Whoever had intruded upon Blackmore Hall that night had planned their escape carefully, leaving behind no clear evidence beyond the injured stable hand's frightened testimony. Over breakfast the following morning, Alara found herself unable to eat, her thoughts consumed by the growing sense that the walls of Blackmore Hall, once merely mysterious, had become genuinely dangerous. "What do we do now?" she asked Ashford, who sat across from her with equally little appetite. "We must move more carefully," he said, "and more quickly. If Gerald suspects we possess evidence against him, he will not wait patiently while we gather our courage to act. We must decide soon how best to use what we have found." "Perhaps it is time to seek help beyond these walls," Alara suggested. "Surely there are officials, magistrates, someone with authority who could investigate properly, someone not already under Gerald's influence." Ashford considered this carefully. "There is a magistrate 2 days' ride from here, a man named Harold Bramwell, who served alongside my father years ago and maintained no close ties to Gerald that I am aware of. If we could reach him safely, present the evidence directly, it might be enough to begin a proper investigation." "Then let us go to him," Alara said firmly, "before Gerald grows any bolder." "The journey carries its own risks," Ashford warned. "If Gerald has spies watching our movements, traveling openly with evidence against him could prove far more dangerous than remaining here." Alara thought for a long moment, weighing the dangers on either side of their difficult choice. "Then let us travel carefully," she said. "Perhaps not as ourselves, at least not obviously. A quiet journey disguised as something far less significant than what it truly is." "I mentioned the ring to you earlier," Alara added. "The stable hand said his attacker wore a heavy ring set with stone. It may be nothing, but I could not help thinking of Gerald's hands covered in rings when he visited only days ago." Ashford's jaw tightened. "It is not proof, but it is one more thread pointing toward the same conclusion we have already reached through other means. I will mention it to the magistrate when we arrive, alongside everything else we carry." A small, appreciative smile crossed Ashford's face, the first genuine warmth she had seen from him since the previous night's chaos. "You have a clever mind, Alara Winters," he said, then caught himself. "Alara Vane, I should say, though I imagine the title still feels unfamiliar." "It does," she admitted, "though perhaps less so than it did a week ago." They spent the following day preparing carefully for their journey, gathering the evidence into a plain, unremarkable bag rather than anything that might draw attention, and arranging for a simple, unmarked carriage rather than one bearing the family's distinctive crest. Ashford instructed only Margaret and Colton of their true destination, trusting them, cautiously, with the details necessary to maintain the household in their absence, while allowing the rest of the staff to believe they traveled simply for a brief visit to distant relations. As evening approached and their departure grew near, a messenger arrived at Blackmore Hall bearing an unexpected letter addressed directly to Alara. She opened it with trembling hands, recognizing her father's familiar, unsteady handwriting. The letter was brief, but its contents sent a fresh wave of fear through her chest. Her father wrote that a man claiming to represent Gerald Ashcombe's business interests had visited him recently, asking pointed questions about the circumstances of her marriage, about conversations she might have shared with him since arriving at Blackmore Hall. Her father, frightened and confused, urged her to be cautious, though he did not fully understand the danger he himself might now be facing. "They have reached my father," Alara said, showing the letter to Ashford, her voice tight with fear. "Gerald knows we suspect something. He is trying to discover how much we know and from whom." Ashford read the letter carefully, his expression darkening with each line. "This complicates matters considerably," he said. "If Gerald believes your father might possess information dangerous to him, even information your father does not realize he holds, he may not hesitate to silence that threat permanently." The blunt statement of danger, spoken so plainly, sent a cold jolt of fear through Alara's entire body. "We must protect him," she said immediately. "Whatever else happens, I cannot allow my father to suffer for a danger he does not even understand." "Then perhaps our path forward has become clearer," Ashford said. "We will travel to the magistrate as planned, but we will also arrange for your father's safety along the way, perhaps bringing him somewhere protected until this matter is fully resolved. Alara felt a swell of gratitude toward the man beside her, a man she had known for barely more than a week, yet who now seemed genuinely committed to protecting not only himself, but her family as well. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding why this matters so much to me." "You are my wife," Ashford said simply. "Whatever family you carry with you into this marriage, I consider it my responsibility to protect as well, regardless of how our arrangement first began." Their journey began under cover of darkness, the unmarked carriage rolling quietly away from Blackmore Hall along a lesser-traveled road that would eventually lead them toward Alara's childhood home, before continuing on to the magistrate's residence. Alara sat close beside Ashford, the leather satchel containing their crucial evidence resting securely between them, her nerves stretched tight with every sound the carriage made against the darkened road. The carriage passed through a small, sleeping village along the way, its windows dark, its streets empty except for a lone dog that barked once at the passing wheels before falling silent again. Alara watched the quiet houses slip past, wondering how many ordinary families slept peacefully within them, untouched by the kind of danger now following her and Ashford through the darkness. "Do you ever wish for an ordinary life?" she asked suddenly, "free of titles and estates and the kind of danger that comes with both?" Ashford considered the question seriously. "There have been nights over the past 6 years when I wished for exactly that. A quiet cottage somewhere far from Blackmore Hall, no title to protect, no legacy to defend, no enemies circling for what I possessed. But I do not think such wishes ever truly change what a person is asked to carry. I would likely have found some other burden to bear, in some other life." "That is a rather bleak view," Alara said, though not unkindly. "Perhaps," Ashford admitted, "though I have found these past weeks that burdens carried alongside someone else feel considerably lighter than those carried in solitude." He glanced at her in the dim light, and Alara found herself, for a brief moment, forgetting the danger surrounding them entirely. "Do you truly believe we will succeed?" she asked quietly, as the hours stretched long into the night. Ashford was silent for a moment before answering. "I believe we have a better chance now than we did a week ago, when I carried this burden entirely alone, hidden behind a lie that grew heavier with each passing year. Whatever happens from here, I am glad, at least, that I no longer face it in isolation." Alara studied his profile in the dim moonlight filtering through the carriage window, noting the tension still evident in his jaw, but also a new kind of resolve she had not seen in him before their conversation in his father's study. Whatever fear or uncertainty still lingered between them, something had shifted since that night, a fragile trust beginning to take root where deception had once stood. As the carriage continued its careful journey through the darkened countryside, Alara found herself reaching for Ashford's hand, an instinctive gesture born of shared fear and uncertain hope. He accepted the small contact without hesitation, his fingers closing gently around hers, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackmore Hall, she felt less like a stranger thrust into danger, and more like a partner facing it alongside someone who genuinely cared for her well-being. "Whatever waits for us at the end of this road," she said quietly, "I am glad it is not a path I am walking alone." "Nor I," Ashford said, his voice soft in the darkness. "Whatever else may be uncertain between us, Alara, know that this much is true." The carriage rolled onward through the night, carrying them both toward an uncertain confrontation with the truth, toward a magistrate who might finally bring justice for a murdered father and years of carefully maintained deception, and toward whatever danger still waited, patiently and dangerously, for the moment they least expected it to strike. The carriage lurched to a sudden stop in the middle of the dark road, throwing Alara forward against the seat, and before she could ask what had happened, she heard the driver shout in alarm, followed immediately by the sound of horses whinnying in distress. Ashford's hand tightened around hers. "Stay low," he whispered urgently, pulling her down beneath the window just as something struck the side of the carriage with a heavy, splintering crack. Outside, voices called out harshly, and Alara caught fragments of the exchange, enough to understand that armed men had blocked their path. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it might be heard through the thin wooden walls surrounding them. Ashford reached into his coat and withdrew a small pistol she had not known he carried, his expression hardening into something fierce and determined. "Whoever is out there," he murmured, "we cannot allow them to take the satchel." The carriage door was wrenched open suddenly, and a large man reached inside, grabbing roughly for the bag resting between them. Ashford moved quickly, striking the man's arm aside and forcing the door shut again, but Alara could hear more voices gathering outside, more footsteps approaching from multiple directions. "There are too many," she whispered, fear sharpening every word. "Then we run," Ashford said, "now while there is still a chance." He pushed open the opposite door, pulling Alara out into the cold night air, and together they fled into the dark tree line bordering the road, leaving the carriage and its assailants behind them. Branches tore at Alara's dress and scratched against her skin as they ran, but she did not slow, driven forward by pure instinct and the sound of shouting voices growing louder behind them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs trembled with exhaustion, finally slowing when the voices behind them faded into distant, scattered calls, their pursuers apparently unable to track them successfully through the dense forest darkness. Ashford pulled Alara behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree, both of them gasping for breath, listening carefully for any sign that danger still followed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands moving gently over her arms, checking for injury despite his own labored breathing. "No," Alara managed, frightened but unharmed. "What about you?" "The same," Ashford said, though a fresh scrape along his temple suggested otherwise. "We cannot return to the road. They will be watching it closely now, searching for us." "Then what do we do?" Ashford considered their surroundings carefully, his mind clearly working through their limited options. The magistrate's residence lies perhaps another day's journey on foot, through difficult terrain. It will be slow and dangerous, but it may be our only remaining path forward. At one point, distant voices carried through the trees behind them, and both of them froze instantly, pressing themselves low against the damp earth beneath a fallen log. Alara held her breath, watching the flicker of a lantern moving slowly along a ridge some distance away, sweeping back and forth as though searching methodically for signs of their passage. The light lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally moving on, the voices fading gradually into the surrounding darkness. "They are searching in the wrong direction," Ashford whispered once it was safe to move again. "For now." "How long before they realize their mistake?" Alara asked, her voice barely audible. "I do not know," he admitted. "We should not linger to find out." They moved carefully through the forest as the night wore on, staying close to the tree line while avoiding open paths where they might be more easily spotted. Alara's feet ached fiercely inside her thin traveling shoes, and exhaustion pulled heavily at every limb, but the fear of capture drove her forward long past the point where she might otherwise have collapsed from fatigue. As dawn began to break, casting pale gray light through the thinning trees, they finally paused to rest near a small stream, drinking gratefully from the cold, clear water. "We have lost the satchel," Alara said, the reality of their situation settling heavily upon her exhausted mind. "All the evidence we gathered, everything we risked to find, taken by Gerald's men." Ashford's expression, though weary, held a note of quiet resolve. "The letters and ledgers are gone, yes, but I remember much of what they contained, and you do as well. Our testimony, combined with the attack itself, provides its own evidence of Gerald's guilt. A man with nothing to hide does not send armed men to intercept a carriage on a darkened road." "Will that be enough for the magistrate?" Alara asked. "I do not know," Ashford admitted honestly. "But it is what remains to us now, and I intend to see this through, whatever the outcome." They continued their difficult journey throughout the following day, exhausted and hungry, avoiding the main roads entirely in favor of narrow forest paths that added considerable distance to their journey, but offered far greater safety from discovery. By the time they finally reached the outskirts of the magistrate's town, both of them were nearly collapsing from exhaustion, their clothing torn and dirtied from 2 days spent fleeing through difficult terrain. Harold Bramwell received them with visible surprise at his residence, his weathered face creasing with concern as he took in their disheveled appearance. "Duke Vane," he said, rising quickly from his desk, "what has happened to you?" Ashford, though exhausted, launched immediately into a full account of everything they had discovered and endured, from the threatening letters found in his father's study to the violent ambush along the darkened road. Alara added her own testimony where needed, confirming details and providing her own observations of Gerald Ashcombe's suspicious behavior during his visit to Blackmore Hall. Bramwell listened carefully throughout their account, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally, "against a man of considerable influence and connection. Without the physical evidence you describe, I will need to proceed carefully to ensure any investigation withstands the scrutiny it will surely face." "There is something more," Alara added, remembering the stable hand's frightened description. "The man who attacked our stables the night before we left wore a heavy ring set with stone. It struck me at the time as an unusual detail for an ordinary thief, but a fitting one for a man such as Gerald Ashcombe." Bramwell made a careful note of this detail as well. Small pieces such as this, gathered together, can sometimes build a case where no single piece would suffice alone. "I will have my men make inquiries quietly, without alerting Gerald to the scope of what we already suspect." "I understand," Ashford said, "but I ask you to begin that investigation regardless. My father deserves justice, however long delayed, and my wife's family deserves protection from the danger now threatening them because of what we have uncovered." Bramwell nodded slowly. "I will send men immediately to secure your father-in-law's safety, and I will begin discreet inquiries into Gerald Ashcombe's business dealings and recent movements. If evidence exists beyond what was taken from you, we will find it." Over the following days, sheltered within the relative safety of Bramwell's protected residence, Alara and Ashford waited anxiously as the investigation slowly gathered momentum. Word arrived that Alara's father had been safely moved to a secure location, alongside Beatrice, both of them shaken but unharmed by the danger that had briefly threatened them. The days of waiting proved difficult in their own quiet way, the fear of the forest and the carriage attack replaced now by the slower, grinding anxiety of uncertainty. Alara spent much of that time seated beside Ashford in Bramwell's modest study, reviewing what fragments of memory they could recall from the stolen letters, writing down details neither of them wanted to forget before time or exhaustion dulled them. In quieter moments, away from the pressing matters of investigation, Alara found herself learning more about the man she had married under such strange circumstances. He spoke hesitantly at first of his childhood before the accident that never truly happened, of a father who had taught him to sail along the northern coast, of a mother who had died when he was young, leaving him with only faint, treasured memories of her voice. Alara shared, in turn, stories of her own mother, of the small garden she had tended before illness took her, of Beatrice's steady presence through years of hardship that might otherwise have broken her family entirely. These quiet exchanges, born from necessity and shared danger, began to feel like something else entirely, a foundation being laid beneath a marriage that had started as nothing more than a desperate arrangement. Slowly, methodically, Bramwell's careful inquiries began uncovering additional evidence. Witnesses willing to speak of Gerald's threatening behavior, financial records suggesting irregular transactions timed suspiciously close to the late Duke's death, and eventually, testimony from one of Gerald's own associates, a man who had grown fearful enough of his employer's increasingly desperate actions to seek protection in exchange for cooperation. The final confrontation came nearly 3 weeks after their harrowing escape through the forest, when Bramwell's men arrived at Gerald Ashcombe's estate with sufficient evidence to demand his arrest. Alara and Ashford were present when Gerald was brought before the magistrate, his usual confident composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence too substantial to easily dismiss. "You cannot prove any of this," Gerald spat, his eyes narrowing dangerously as he looked toward Ashford across the room. "You always were a fool, cousin, hiding behind your pretend blindness, while I built something real from the ashes your father left behind. The pretense is finished, Gerald, Ashford said quietly. Meeting his cousin's gaze directly for the first time in years without any hesitation or deception. As is your influence over this family's affairs. Gerald's composure finally shattered entirely, and in his anger, he revealed more than he likely intended, admitting fragments of his role in orchestrating the late Duke's death, confirming everything Ashford had long suspected but never been able to fully prove. Bramwell's men led him away in restraints, his protests growing fainter as he was removed from the room, and for the first time in 6 long years, Ashford stood in a room without the weight of uncertain suspicion hanging over him. "It is over," Alara said softly, standing beside him as they watched Gerald's departure. "Yes," Ashford said, though his voice carried a complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief. "My father can finally rest knowing his death will not go unanswered." They returned to Blackmore Hall several days later, the household staff greeting their arrival with visible relief and quiet celebration. Margaret embraced Alara warmly at the entrance, tears of relief shining in her eyes, and even Colton allowed himself a small, genuine smile as he welcomed them home. That evening, Ashford found Alara standing on the balcony outside her chambers, looking out over the estate grounds now bathed in the soft golden light of sunset rather than the shadowed darkness that had greeted her upon her first arrival. He joined her quietly, his eyes, no longer hidden beneath any deceptive cloth, reflecting the same warm light spreading across the horizon. "I owe you more gratitude than I know how to properly express," he said. "You arrived here as a stranger, forced into a marriage neither of us truly chose, and yet you faced every danger that followed with more courage than I had any right to expect." "We faced it together," Alara said, turning to look at him directly. "That matters more than how our marriage began." Ashford reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining gently with hers. "When this began, I told myself I was protecting you by keeping you at a careful distance, by treating our marriage as simply a necessary arrangement rather than something deeper. I find now that such distance is no longer something I wish to maintain." Alara felt her heart quicken at his words, recognizing in them an honesty far removed from the careful deceptions that had once defined their earliest days together. "And what do you wish instead?" she asked softly. "I wish for a marriage built on the same honesty we have finally found between us," Ashford said. "Not a shield against danger, not a convenient arrangement born of debt and desperation, but something chosen freely by both of us, now that the truth stands fully revealed between us." Alara considered his words carefully, thinking back over the frightening, uncertain journey that had brought them to this quiet, golden evening together. She thought of her father's desperate bargain, of the blind Duke's carefully maintained deception, of locked doors and threatening letters, and a desperate flight through darkened forests. And she thought, too, of the quiet trust that had slowly grown between them throughout every dangerous moment they had faced side by side. "I choose this," she said finally, her voice steady and sure. "Not because my father arranged it, and not because circumstance forced it upon us, but because I have come to know the man standing beside me, and I find that I do not wish to face whatever comes next without him." Ashford's expression softened into something Alara had not seen from him before, a genuine, unguarded happiness that transformed his features entirely. He lifted her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her fingers. "Then let us build something new together," he said quietly, "free from the shadows that once surrounded this house, and grounded instead in the honesty we have finally found." Together they stood on the balcony as the sun continued its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the grounds of Blackmore Hall, a house that had once seemed cold and secretive, but now, at last, felt genuinely like a home being built anew. The dangers that had followed them since Alara's arrival had finally been laid to rest, and in their place remained something far more valuable than the wealth or security her father's desperate bargain had originally promised. A marriage chosen freely, forged through shared courage, and grounded in a truth neither of them intended to hide from ever again. A crowd had gathered outside the courthouse long before the doors opened. More people than the small town had seen assembled in one place for many years, all of them eager to witness the trial of a man whose name had once commanded fear and respect in equal measure. Alara stood beside Ashford near the front steps, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, watching the crowd part slowly as guards led Gerald Ashcombe up the stone steps in restraints. Gerald's once confident posture had crumbled considerably over the weeks since his arrest. His fine coat had been replaced with plain, undignified clothing, and his eyes, when they briefly met Ashford's across the courtyard, held none of the calculating amusement Alara remembered from their first meeting at Blackmore Hall. Instead, she saw only bitterness, and beneath it, something that looked almost like fear. The trial itself lasted 3 long days, filled with testimony from witnesses Alara had never met, servants and business associates who had quietly observed Gerald's dealings over the years without daring to speak against him until now. Harold Bramwell presented the evidence methodically, weaving together threatening letters, financial irregularities, and first-hand accounts into a picture too complete to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. When the verdict finally came, delivered in a courtroom so silent that Alara could hear her own heartbeat, Gerald Ashcombe was found guilty of orchestrating the death of the late Duke, and sentenced to spend the remainder of his life imprisoned far from the estate he had once hoped to control entirely. As the guards led him away for the final time, he did not look back toward Ashford or Alara. His shoulders finally bowed under the full weight of consequences he had spent years avoiding. Outside the courthouse afterward, Ashford stood quietly for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, and Alara understood that this moment, though it brought justice, did not erase the years of grief and isolation that had preceded it. She said nothing, simply standing beside him, offering her presence rather than empty words of comfort. "It is strange," Ashford finally said, "to feel relief and sorrow so completely intertwined. My father is gone regardless of today's verdict. 6 years of hiding cannot be returned to me, no matter how thoroughly justice has now been served." "No," Alara agreed gently, "but you no longer have to hide, and that is no small thing. Whatever years were lost, the years ahead remain entirely your own now." He looked down at her, something warm passing across his features despite the weight still evident in his expression. "Our own," he corrected softly, "not simply mine." They returned to Blackmore Hall to find the household transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. Word of Gerald's conviction had spread quickly through the surrounding villages, and the fearful glances and hushed whispers that had once followed the Vane family name began, slowly, to give way to something closer to open curiosity and cautious respect. Villagers who had once looked away from passing carriages now offered polite nods of acknowledgement, and merchants who had rarely visited the estate began sending inquiries about renewed business arrangements. The village nearest the estate held a small gathering not long after the trial concluded, a modest celebration meant to mark the community's relief at seeing years of quiet fear finally lifted from their doorsteps. Alara and Ashford attended together, and she watched with quiet satisfaction as villagers who had once looked away from passing carriages now approached freely, offering warm greetings and grateful words neither of them had expected to receive so openly. An elderly woman, one of the first to speak with them that evening, took Alara's hands in her own weathered palms. "We did not know what to think all these years of the family up at the great house," she admitted. "Fear breeds strange stories, and we let ourselves believe the worst rather than ask for the truth. I am glad, for all our sakes, that the truth turned out kinder than the rumors." "We are glad as well," Alara said warmly, "to finally be known as neighbors rather than strangers behind an iron gate." Ashford, for the first time in years, began stepping beyond the walls of Blackmore Hall without any pretense of blindness weighing upon him. He visited neighboring estates, attended gatherings he had long avoided, and slowly began rebuilding the connections his father had once maintained before everything had fallen into shadow and suspicion. Alara often accompanied him on these visits, watching with quiet pride as he gradually reclaimed the confident, engaged presence Margaret had once described from his younger years, before tragedy had forced him into hiding. Alara's own father arrived at Blackmore Hall several weeks after the trial concluded, traveling alongside Beatrice, both of them still visibly shaken by the danger they had briefly faced, but grateful beyond words for their safety and the resolution finally achieved. Edmund Winters stood awkwardly in the grand entrance hall, clearly uncertain of his welcome after everything his desperate bargain had set into motion. "I do not know how to properly apologize," he said quietly, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. "I sent you into danger I could not have imagined, all to save myself from consequences of my own making." Alara studied her father for a long moment, thinking of everything that had unfolded since that frightened morning when creditors had pounded on their door. The anger she had once carried toward him had softened considerably over the weeks since, tempered by everything she had learned about resilience, trust, and the unexpected ways difficult beginnings could sometimes lead toward genuine happiness. "You made a desperate choice, born from fear rather than cruelty," she said finally. "It led me somewhere I never expected, through danger neither of us could have predicted. But it also led me here, to a life I would not now choose to undo, even knowing everything that came before it." Her father's eyes filled with tears he made no effort to hide. "Then perhaps some good came from my failures after all." "Perhaps," Alara agreed, stepping forward to embrace him properly for the first time since her departure from their old home. "Though I hope, in the future, we might find better paths forward than desperate bargains and hidden debts." Beatrice, watching the reunion with quiet satisfaction, stepped forward as well, embracing Alara warmly. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become," she said softly. "Braver and wiser than any of us dared hope." Edmund and Beatrice remained at Blackmore Hall for several weeks, and Alara found genuine comfort in watching her father slowly rebuild his own sense of purpose, assisting with small matters of estate management under Ashford's patient guidance, gradually restoring some measure of the dignity his years of failing debts had stripped away. The house itself seemed to grow warmer with each passing week, its once oppressive silence replaced gradually by the sounds of genuine conversation, occasional laughter, and the steady rhythm of a household no longer burdened by secrets and suspicion. As autumn deepened into winter, Alara found herself standing once again on the balcony outside her chambers, watching snow begin to fall gently across the estate grounds below. Ashford joined her there, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders against the growing chill. "You seem thoughtful this evening," he observed, settling beside her. "I am thinking of how much has changed since I first arrived here," Alara said. "I remember standing at this very window on my first night, terrified of everything I did not understand, uncertain whether I would find safety or danger within these walls." "And now?" Ashford asked. "Now I find myself grateful for a path I never would have chosen for myself, yet one that led me somewhere I am genuinely happy to remain." She turned to look at him directly. "I have something else to share with you, something I only recently confirmed myself." Ashford's expression grew attentive, curious. "What is it?" Alara took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach, watching understanding slowly dawn across his features. "By summer," she said softly, "Blackmore Hall will welcome a new voice into its halls, one that has never known fear or deception, only the honesty we have built together." Ashford's eyes filled with an emotion too complex to name simply as joy, though joy formed the largest part of it, mixed with lingering wonder at how thoroughly his life had transformed since the desperate arrangement that had first brought Alara into his world. He drew her close, resting his forehead gently against hers. "A new beginning," he murmured, "for a house that has known far too much sorrow." "A new beginning," Alara agreed, "built on truth rather than secrets." Together, they watched the snow continue falling over the grounds of Blackmore Hall, transforming the twisted garden hedges and dark stone walls into something softer, gentler, blanketed in quiet white peace. The house that had once whispered of hidden dangers and fearful rumors now stood as testament to a different kind of story entirely, one where courage had triumphed over deception, where trust had grown steadily from the fragile beginnings of a marriage neither party had originally chosen for themselves. Alara thought back, one final time, to the frightened 19-year-old girl who had climbed into a carriage bound for an unknown fate, given away by a desperate father to a man the world called the Blind Duke. That girl could never have imagined the truth waiting for her at the end of that long road, nor the genuine happiness that would eventually grow from such uncertain, dangerous beginnings. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for Ashford and Alara Vane, they would face them now as true partners, bound not by desperate arrangement or careful deception, but by a hard-won trust forged through shared danger and mutual courage. And within the walls of Blackmore Hall, once so cold and silent, warmth had finally, permanently, found its place.